Today, we will be speaking about the defense policy and political lessons around two different U.S. military aircraft, the A-10 and the F-35. Our guest is Dan Grazier, Senior Defense Policy Fellow at the Project on Government Oversight and a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. Welcome, Dan. The floor is yours.
Hey, thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here and welcome everybody. Hopefully you all find this informative and maybe even a little entertaining. So why don't we just get right into it? So we're here to talk about aircraft, and I can assure you, after more than 7 years working in defense policy circles in Washington, D.C., that few things will provoke an emotional reaction in national security circles more than talking about aircraft. And the two aircraft that seem to generate the biggest reactions are the F-35 and the A-10. And there's a lot of reasons that go into that, but really to understand exactly why both of these aircraft cause so much friction, you have to understand some history, and to really understand that, you almost have to go all the way back to the Wright brothers, because a lot of the underlying issues are just delve that far back into military aviation history. So let's move on here to to the next slide, and if we can talk about the competing air power visions. So the F-35 and the A-10 are both products of very different visions of the role of military combat aviation. So the F-35's roots, again, really go all the way back to the Wright brothers almost, and the idea that aviation is this military aviation is really this revolutionary force that forever dramatically altered military affairs. And it goes right to the heart of strategic air power theory. So it's the idea that was put forward by the Italian guy Julio Douhet and the American Billy Mitchell and the Englishman Hugh Trenchard. It's the idea that aviation, when controlled by aviators, striking targets selected by aviators, can win wars independently of ground operations. That is a vision that, while most airmen today won't acknowledge that that's what they think, it's still really at the core, one, of just the independent Air Force by itself, and it really is a centerpiece of aviation air power thought even today. And so the F-35 was really built for that. It's a stealth aircraft. It's built to fly deep inside enemy territory, to strike targets far beyond the reach of ground forces. And ideally, if you look at the writings of John Warden from the 1980s and 1990s, the idea is to create strategic paralysis by finding those key targets that on which the entire enemy system is built. You strike those targets with a couple of bombs, you bring them down, and the idea is that you at least paralyze the enemy system and make it a lot easier to defeat. Now the A-10, by contrast, is it's based on a much more conventional vision of combined arms warfare, where all the elements of military power really come together to mutually support one another. So where the strength of one arm covers the weakness of another one, and when it all works together and it's all fully integrated, the idea is that you kind of create this really strong, armored, prickly, unified unit with all elements, both on the air and in the ground and on the ground. And so, and that really goes against a lot of conventional Air Force thinking. The idea of strategic air power is to operate independently of the ground forces. And so this is really a source of a lot of the friction and why both of these aircraft generate the reactions that they do, because it's not just about the technology, it's about the idea of how they're employed. And that's the real source of the friction. And going here and again, going back in history just to see the priorities of the Air Force and Air Force thinking, you could go back to some of the primary documents. So the one on the left of the screen, it's a screenshot of FM 100 TAC 20, dates back to 1943, and this document is known today colloquially as the Air Force Declaration of Independence. So this is something that the aviators in the Army Air Forces came up with, and it was signed off by General Marshall in 1943. And the opening sentence of this document says that land power and air power are co-equal and interdependent forces, and neither is an auxiliary of the other. So this was the airmen saying that, look, we have a unique role, and while we work side by side for the strategic goals. We aren't your auxiliary, you aren't our auxiliary. We operate differently, and so we need to operate unencumbered by the needs of the ground forces. And when you look through this document, you go to page 6 and you look at the basic tasks, and this shows you the priorities of the airmen and how they think that air power should be employed. So, they're talking about, one, destroying hostile air forces, to gain that air superiority, then deny the establishment to destroy existing bases. That's, again, strategic power, strategic air power. You want to find those key nodes and apply air power there to collapse the enemy system. And then operate against hostile land or sea forces. What they're talking about there is using air power, again, far in front of the ground forces. And it's only when you get down, down to the 5th priority is operate as part of a task force in the conduct of military operations. That's what we call close air support right there. So it's 5th in their list. And then you look on the other side here, it's a screenshot from the Key West Agreement from 1948. So after the Independent Air Force was created with the passage of the National Security Act of 1947, there was a lot of details that needed to be worked out. And so the first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, gathered all the service leaders to the Key West Naval Station in the spring of 1948 to hash out roles and missions. And again, this is just a couple of years removed from FM 100 TAC 20. And but you can see, again, still in the Key West Agreement, this is a prioritization of air tasks. And it's only when you get down to the 5th in the list is where they're talking about what we call close air support. So again, this goes all the way back to the very roots of the Independent Air Force about about how air tasks are prioritized, and you can see how far down on the list close air support comes. So keep that in mind, because this is a big source of friction, and this is one of the reasons why the A-10 becomes such a dramatic issue. But let's go into each of the aircraft. Let's talk about some background and history of the F-35. So the F-35 program, you can really trace its origins back to 1993, and in that year, the Marine Corps was looking to design a direct replacement for the AV-8B Harrier. So the vertical takeoff and landing fighter jet that the Marine Corps still operates even today in 2022, although not as often anymore. That, interestingly enough, was the very first independent procurement program that the Marine Corps did. And so they wanted to continue that tradition by building, an American design replacement for the Harrier. And so that program is called the Common Affordable Lightweight Fighter Program. And shortly afterwards, the Air Force started their own program to replace some of their aircraft, specifically the F-16 and to a lesser degree, the A-10 at that point. But that program is called the Joint Advanced Strike Technology Project. So both of these date all the way back to the early 1990s. But then in the timing, the context is important. So these programs were both launched in right after the end of the Cold War. So this is right at the height of the Clinton administration's peace dividend. And so President Clinton's one of President Clinton's defense secretaries, Les Aspin, decided that why are we building two separate programs? Why don't we just combine them and build one aircraft that can meet the needs for all the services? And if you want to trace the problems with the F-35 today back to their origin, it was that decision by Les Aspin back in, I think it was 1994, to combine these two programs and to create what we now call the Joint Strike Fighter program. So that decision created one common program, but three variants. And as we're looking here at this picture, you got to look from right to left. So on the right, that is the F-35A. That is the conventional takeoff variant for the Air Force. That's meant to be a direct replacement for the F-16 and the A-10. The one in the middle is the F-35B. That is the short takeoff and vertical landing variant for the Marine Corps. And then the big guy on the left is the F-35C. That's the Navy's carrier variant, which needs to have a bigger wing so it can take off and land from aircraft carriers. And that one's meant to be a replacement for, and it's actually operated by the Navy and the Marine Corps. And it's meant to be a replacement for the F-18 and the EA-6B Prowler electronic warfare aircraft. So, but as you're looking at these three variants, you can almost see in this picture the source of a lot of the problems and the friction for the F-35 program. So attempting to cram all the capabilities, attempting to cram, multiple, the capabilities to perform multiple roles into one aircraft by itself is a really daunting prospect. You end up with a very complex aircraft that's also very expensive. So now you expand that and you have to create one common airframe to meet the needs to meet multiple mission roles and all the needs for three separate services. And then you've just expanded that complexity. Now you add in the fact that the F-35 from the very beginning was designed to meet the needs of not just the US services, but also the needs of all of our partner nations. And then you can see how all that complexity just kind of stacks up, and it created the monstrosity really that is the F-35 as far as complexity goes. Because that's a lot of cooks in the kitchen that are all trying to get their design requirements into this airframe. And so that's really the source of the schedule delays and the dramatic costs. And also, and because of that complexity, I'll get into this a little bit more, not just the schedule delays, but also a lot of reliability issues too, just because it is so complex. Let's talk about the politics of the F-35 a little bit here. So one thing about the F-35 is that as far as when we talk about politics of it, the powers that be in both the defense industry and the Pentagon really took a lot of lessons that they learned over the years, and then they applied them with the F-35, but then they magnified them. So, over the years, they figured out that when you have a defense contract in a state, then wherever that defense contract is, whatever congressional district that is, you have a representative that is politically invested in that program. They have a vested political interest in making sure that program continues. But then each state also has two senators. So then there's two senators in that state that that become big proponents almost automatically for that program. And so then it was realized that, hey, wait a second, if we split this contract up and we put it in two states, then we'll have two representatives and two more senators that have a vested political interest in this program. And so you expand that out, and then you get the F-35 program, which has been split up, and it is now in 47 states and hundreds of congressional districts, so many that we haven't even been able to figure out exactly how many. It's upwards of 350. So that's a lot of organic political support for the F-35 program. Now, in my little circle of defense reformers, we call this political engineering. The Pentagon actually has a term for this. They call it, they call it strategic contracting. And it's a tried and true method that they have to to boost political support for these programs, but it has some consequences to it. And one, in order to have enough subcontracts to spread around to ensure that political support, there's an incentive to increase the complexity of the design, because you have to come up with all these different widgets to spread out all over the country. And so, again, it incentivizes adding bells and whistles to one of these programs. Now, that's problematic because each bell and whistle that you add to a weapon system is one more thing that can break. And so you just increase the chances of having components fail on these systems, and in this case in an aircraft, that's going to keep it on the ground, and it's going to impact its mission capable rates. And so I'm going to talk about that here in a little more detail here in a second. But this idea of the economic impact and spreading these contracts all over the country is something that's celebrated, even though it's actually very, it does create a lot of problems. Lockheed Martin brags about it all the time. This is a screenshot from Lockheed Martin's website. I took this yesterday because they have a helpful map. If you go on F35.com, it's a website that's owned and operated by Lockheed Martin. You can find the economic impact page, and they have this interactive map where you can scroll over and you can see how many suppliers, how many jobs they're claiming are created, and the annual dollar value for the economic impact of the program. And I'll leave this for the audience. You can try to figure this out. So there are all but 3 states have suppliers of the F-35. So if any of you can figure out which 3 states don't, I'll be interested to see. But overall, Lockheed Martin brags about having an annual economic impact of $65 billion for the F-35 program. They claim to have created 298,000 jobs. And have issued contracts to 1,650 high-tech suppliers. Now, the jobs claim is a little dubious because what they claim as an F-35 job, like when they talk about it, they basically they create the impression that these are full-time jobs of people who are working directly on the F-35. But in reality, a lot of these manufacturers build a lot of things for different programs. Let's say you have there's a company out in Washington that builds transparencies. So they build like the glass for that's actually polymers for the canopies. Well, that company is not just building canopies for the F-35. They're building transparencies for a lot of different aircraft. But for purposes like this, Lockheed Martin's going to count all the jobs in that factory, and they're going to create the impression that they are full-time jobs. So these people are doing nothing but building components for the F-35. So that's a little disingenuous, but it's a very effective claim to use in political campaigns, which is exactly what they intended with it. Let's talk about some of the drawbacks of the F-35. So we'll just talk about the development delays. So I told you that the F-35 program, its origins were in 1993. And just to provide you some context for that, as I'm sitting here right now, I am 44 years old. In 1993, when this program really kicked off, I was a freshman in high school. I have a son who's 19 years old now and is a petty officer, 3rd class in the United States Navy. So just to give you that time horizon and how long this program has gone on. That's I've gone through quite a bit in life since this program began. And really, the F-35 program, per the original plan, would be a mature program at this point. Lockheed Martin won the contract to develop the F-35 in October of 2001. And based on the original plan, Lockheed Martin was to have provided 2,866 aircraft for $233 billion. And the program should have entered full-rate production in 2012. But right now, in 2022, 10 years after that date, the program is now supposed to produce 2,457 aircraft for approximately $428 billion. And that's according to the most recently available selected acquisition report. But the program, the services, the Pentagon, the Joint Program Office, they still can't tell us when the F-35 is going to go into full-rate production, even still in 2022. There's a couple of reasons for that. The major reason is that the program cannot complete the initial operational test and evaluation process because the F-35 is so complicated, and because the promises of the capabilities, the mission capabilities, are so broad, they can't actually even test all of them in the real world. So they require a very sophisticated simulator to be able to test like the big multi-ship, flights that they envision with F-35's trading information, and you have one F-35 that spots a target, and then another F-35 uses that data to then fire. They can't even test that in the real world, so they have to build a simulator to do it. And there's kind of a long story that goes along with this, but as part of the original contract that was awarded to Lockheed, in addition to building the aircraft, Lockheed was given the contract to build the simulator to test their product. And so if that sounds odd, it is. It's very much like, taking high school biology, and then your teacher tells you that you're going to write your own test for it. Well, that's exactly what the Pentagon did with Lockheed Martin and the F-35. As a result, much like that student would probably not write a test that was going to be too hard, Lockheed Martin dragged their feet, and they did not build the simulator to fully test the program. So in 2015, that program was taken away from Lockheed Martin and given to the Navy. The Navy promised that they could build the thing in 2 years. And here we are in 2022, and they still can't say when that thing's going to be done. So it remains to be seen when the F-35 goes into full rate production. But even if it happens in the next couple of years, the F-35, will not be a fully developed aircraft. So the Joint Program Office proudly declared a couple of years ago that the system design and development phase of the program was over. And so they basically said that they'd completed the design work on the F-35. Well, that's not true. So now the F-35 is in what they're calling the modernization phase, but it's not the modernization phase, because the program, they did not finish all the design work. They have not been able to deliver the full capabilities that were promised as part of the original design process. And so instead of extending that process even more, which they already did at least twice, they basically just kicked the can down the road, and they said that all these capabilities that we were supposed to deliver here, well, that's just part of the modernization process now. So if you hear Block 4 or just F-35 modernization, just know that they aren't really modernizing the F-35. They're just completing the design work that should have been completed years ago, and at great expense. At least about $15 billion at this point is what's estimated. And that process isn't expected to be completed until 2028 or 2029 now. So it still has a long way to go. Let's talk about cost a little bit more here. So the F-35 program is expected to cost, over its lifespan, $1.7 trillion. That's trillion with a T. So that includes the $428 billion to design and build the fleet. And then the balance of that is to operate the fleet out through the 2060s. Now, I talk about cost for a couple of important reasons, and probably not what a lot of people expect. There's a lot of people who harp on the cost of the F-35 because they'd like to see that money spent elsewhere on other things like non-military things. I generally talk about cost of weapons programs because it has an impact on military operations. So when costs increase the way they do with the F-35, that makes the program vulnerable to cuts down the road. And we've seen this again and again through history. So there's a couple of really good examples, like relatively recent examples. So the F-22 is a good example of that. Originally, we were supposed to get 850 F-22s. But as the design process dragged out and as the cost increased, the number of aircraft to be purchased shrank to the point that we ended up with 187 F-22s. The B-2 program is another really good example of that. Originally, we were supposed to get 132 B-2s, but we ended up with 24 of them. Again, as the design process stretched out beyond what was expected and the cost increased, then the way to control that was to decrease the buy. So that is a big impact on force structure, because the services start these programs with a force structure in mind. Like, we need to buy this many aircraft because we have this many units, and this many squadrons. So we need all these aircraft to fill those squadrons. And so this is a big reason why it's important to control costs, so that you can buy enough of these weapons, whatever it is, to be able to flesh out your force. So that's a big problem. Another big problem with complexity, or with cost in general, is increased cost add up to increased complexity. And so that has a direct impact on military operations. I'm going to talk about this here. Actually, let's just move the slide ahead, and I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. So this is a chart from a recent GAO report about the F-35. And this talks about mission capable rates and full mission capable rates. And just to walk you through here, just to explain this a little bit, there's 3 different variants. So this shows the performance of of all 3 fleets across 3 years. And the one that you should pay particular attention to is the one on the left, the full mission capable rate. So with the full mission capable rate, that is the percentage of time that aircraft in a squadron are available to perform all the assigned missions for that squadron. And so when you're talking about a multi-role aircraft like the F-35, the full mission capable rate is the appropriate metric to pay attention to. Now, the services like talking about mission capable rates, and if you look on the right, you can see that the mission capable rates are a lot higher than the full mission capable rates. So they like using that metric because it looks better than the full mission capable rates. But what a mission capable rate is that's the percentage of aircraft that can perform one of its assigned missions. And really, an aircraft that can take off and land is technically a mission capable aircraft. It doesn't mean that aircraft can actually perform a mission once it's up in the air. So that's not a very accurate measure of how the fleet's really performing. But you go back to the full mission capable rates, you can see where this excess complexity really impacts the performance of the program. So the F-35A, all the way on the left, that's the Air Force variant, the conventional takeoff. It performs better than the rest of the fleets, but even in its best year in 2020, it only had a 54% full mission capable rate. For an effective unit in a combat scenario, you want to have a fleet that is above 80 and really above 90% full mission capable rate. And you can see that even in the best year, it didn't come anywhere close to that. That's just the F-35A. Then you look at the F-35B and the F-35C, and you see that those numbers are really atrocious. That's a failed program right there. If you just look at that right there, you don't need to know anything else about the program. That shows you that the F-35 does not do what we need it to do. And so and these numbers, I've been watching this program in detail for more than 7 years now, and these numbers have not shifted that much, over that span. So there's a lot of talk, about about how the F-35 is getting better. Well, you can look at this and you can see that there's some marginal changes here and there, but it's not living up to expectations. So yes, I'm always quite skeptical when I hear people talking about that, because you can just refer back to this and you can see that it's not really living up to expectations. So, but that's enough depressing talk about the F-35. Let's talk about the A-10, something that I think is a lot more exciting. So the A-10C Thunderbolt II, or as it's affectionately called, the Warthog. So the A-10 program it's unique in that it was the first aircraft program in history to be designed from the very beginning to be a close air support platform. There have been other aircraft in the past that were quite effective in that role. So the P-47 Thunderbolt I during World War II was a really effective close air support aircraft, but that was originally designed as a fighter. The A-1 Skyraider that was really prominent in Vietnam also was very effective in that role, but it was not designed from the beginning to be a close air support aircraft. So the A-10 really is a special program, just because of its origins, and just for a little bit of background on how it came about. So the A-10 resulted from a turf war between the Air Force and the Army. So in the 1960s, by the 1960s, the Army was very frustrated with the Air Force, over the years in both Korea and Vietnam, in the level of support that the Air Force was providing them. And so by the mid 1960s, the Army was basically ready to give up on working with the Air Force as far as close air support goes. And so the Army, let me back up here just a little bit. So by the 1960s, the Army had actually created what's called the Army's Second Air Force. And the Army started buying a lot of fixed wing aircraft, a lot of like small cargo aircraft, and some observation planes, a couple different programs. And they were essentially creating a second Air Force. And that alarmed Air Force leaders because they thought the Army was kind of cutting into their turf. And really, the Army was cutting into their turf. And so that caused a lot of friction. But in 1966, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General McConnell, and the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Johnson, got together and they they and their staffs hashed out what's known today as the Johnson-McConnell Agreement of 1966. And the takeaway from that was the Army agreed to give up basically all of its fixed-wing aircraft to the Air Force in return for the Air Force allowing the Army to pursue helicopters. But the Air Force also gave lavish promises that they were going to provide all the close air support that the Army would ever need. And so everybody left happy, except for, one guy in particular did not. His name was Colonel Avery Kay. He was kind of a legendary figure in the Air Force in that he was the lead navigator of if you know your Air Force history and World War II history, he was the lead navigator on the Schweinfurt raid. It was the big mission to bomb ball bearing factories in Germany during World War II. Resulted in 60 B-17s being lost in a single mission. But Avery Kay was the lead navigator of that. But in the 1960s, he was working in the office of the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and he was the one that negotiated a lot of the language about close air support with the Army as part of the Johnson-McConnell agreements. And Colonel Kay was negotiating in good faith. He genuinely believed that the Air Force is going to live up to these promises. And it was only afterwards that he figured out that the Air Force had no intention of living up to that. And so he took that personally, and then he began looking for an opportunity to make good on the promises that he had made to his Army counterparts. And so the Army kind of created this situation, created the opportunity for him because after the Johnson-McConnell Agreement, the Army started designing the Cheyenne helicopter. It was the American answer to the Soviet Hind big flying tank helicopter that they still operate today. And it was a Lockheed program, and it was this big, complicated thing that probably would not have worked even if it had made it into production. But Colonel Kay saw an opportunity with that, and he went to General McConnell and he said, "Look, sir, if you don't do anything to stop this helicopter program, you're going to be the Army's going to get the close air support role from us." And they're going to get the budget share. And if you don't stop this, you're going to be the Chief of Staff that's going to go down in history as losing this mission and that budget share for the Air Force. Well, that spurred him into action, and so he basically ordered the Air Force to design a close air support aircraft to defeat the Cheyenne. And so that led to the creation of the AX, the AX program, and it was a group inside the Pentagon that worked together to first study the close air support mission, understand what was needed and what characteristics an aircraft designed specifically for that role needed. And because the designers were operating from a clean slate, they had an opportunity to incorporate a lot of really unique design features into the aircraft to make it really effective for the role. And you can look just in this picture, and I can point out a couple of them. Like one, you take a look at the engines and how they're mounted on the outside of the fuselage of the A10. That is done for a reason, because what that does, it keeps the engines away from the fuel. So the fuel tanks of the A10 are inside the fuselage. There's I think 4 of them. So there's 2 in the fuselage, centerline fuselage, and then there's 2 in the on either, or there's 1 on either wing. And so then the fuel's piped out to those nacelles. So it keeps the fuel separated from the engine. So that greatly reduces the fire risk. You contrast that with the F-35. The F-35 is essentially a blowtorch that's wrapped around a gas can. And so it makes the A10 very vulnerable, or it makes the F-35 very vulnerable to ground fire, which is why you're never really going to see the F-35 flying, close air support where they're coming in, right within visual range, because it's really dangerous for them. But the A10's not. And another interesting design feature of it is of the A10, and this is something it's pretty relevant for some of the arguments today, because one of the key vulnerability, or one of the arguments that's made, to retire the A10 is to say that it's extremely vulnerable to surface launch missiles. Well, the A10 has a really ingenious design feature that makes it a lot less vulnerable to those kind of weapons than a lot of people think. So if you look at where the engines are, and then you look at the vertical stabilizers at the rear of the aircraft. There's 2 of them that are set out away from the fuselage. Whereas a lot of aircraft, they'll have a vertical stabilizer like right on the center line of the aircraft. Well, the A10 has 2 of them on the outside, and it also has a big pylon, that holds them in place. Well, if you look at where they're placed, the hot part of the engine, the part of the aircraft that's going to attract an infrared or a heat-seeking missile is the back of the engine. But the back of the engines of the A10 are shielded by those stabilizers. So when you look at the A10 from the side, if you were trying to shoot it from the side, that vertical stabilizer is going to block a lot of that heat signature. And same thing from the bottom with that big pylon. So it's only when you get a shot from directly behind the A10 where that heat signature really picks up. And at that point, if you get that tail on shot of the A10, it's already moving away from the launch site, and that makes it a lot easier for the pilot and the aircraft to evade that missile and evade that threat. Now, another couple of features, lots been made about the titanium bathtub. So the designers, the design team figured out really quickly that they had to make this aircraft extremely survivable. Otherwise, and the pilots had to know and trust that this aircraft was survivable, because that was the only way that they would really fly it down low where they need to be really effective. And so, the pilot sits in what's called a titanium. They call it a titanium bathtub. It's this big, thick, armored plate, really, that the pilot's sitting inside, and that protects the pilot from ground fire up to 23 millimeter rounds. So it's very heavily protected. Just protected the pilot. It also has a lot of redundancy built in. You can, the 2 engines, the A10 can fly on one engine if one gets knocked out. It has redundant systems inside. It has 2 hydraulic systems. So if one's damaged, then the other one kicks in. And if both are both hydraulic systems to control the flight surfaces are knocked out, there's even a backup to that, like an old, wire and pulley system, mechanical system that the pilot can engage. So it's a lot of features like that make the A10 hugely survivable. You just look at the wings, how long the wings are. They're far longer than they need to be for that size of an aircraft. And so you can shoot off the tail of the half a tail, and the A10 is still going to fly. You can shoot off half the wing, and the A10 is still going to fly. Here's a picture. Is one of my favorites. as an A-10 coming in for a controlled landing after one of the engines that had been hit by a heat-seeking missile in Iraq. So, and there's a lot of stories about this, about A-10s that have gotten shot up and have brought their pilots safely home. And so, another key thing about the A10 is it was designed to be supported in the field. And so, logistics are a big issue in all things. You can think back to the slide with the F-35 and its mission capable rates. That shows the logistical challenge with the F-35. Those mission capable rates show that it's difficult to keep the F-35 in fighting order. So that's a logistical challenge. Now, the A-10 does not have that, that big of a logistical challenge, because it was designed from the very beginning to be quickly turned around, to have a high sortie generation rate. And so it can be rearmed really quickly. It can be refueled very quickly. A lot of the parts are interchangeable left and right. So let's say you had two A-10s, and one of them had the right wing shot off and the other one had the left wing shot off. Well, you can take, the good wing from one aircraft and you can bolt it on to the other aircraft, and they're interchangeable side to side. So there's a lot of things like that, that are really ingenious, that all leads to having a very effective, effective program in the much larger sense. So, and going back to the F-35 a little bit, even if the F-35 could perform all the missions and, could do everything that was promised, you look back to that fully mission capable rate, if the F-35, even if it could do all of that, and I'm not saying that it can, because it really can't, but even if it could do all of that, if it can't do it reliably, then the whole program was really wasted. Well, the designers of the A-10 understood all of that. And so they designed this aircraft specifically to have a high sortie generation rate, because that's what makes an effective program overall. And then we'll talk about the history here, the operational history. So the A-10 went into production in 1976, had a production run of about 718 aircraft through 1984. But the A-10 got its first taste of combat, real taste of combat, in 1991. But even then, in 1991, the Air Force was actively retiring A-10 squadrons. And the A-10 almost did not get its shot to prove itself in Desert Storm, but it was realized that it was needed, and so 132 of them were sent overseas, and that's where the A-10 really made its reputation, because the A-10 wreaked havoc on the Republican Guard units, and it was used to hunt Scud missile launchers a lot. It was pressing in a lot of roles that originally weren't really envisioned. It was not used all that much in a traditional close air support role, but that's actually kind of a good thing. I can if there's anybody interested, we can talk a lot more about the difference between close air support and offensive air support, because they are two different missions. But the A-10 was mostly used in an offensive air support role, which I actually think is much more important than close air support. And just really quickly, so close air support is it's an air mission where there is, it requires direct, detailed coordination between the unit on the ground and the unit in the air. So you have a ground controller who identifies a target, communicates that up to the aircraft, to the pilot, and then the pilot is only drops on control of that ground, at the orders of the ground controller. Now, offensive air support is where the aircraft are operating in direct support of ground units, but out beyond that range of requiring direct control. And so that's where and that's actually a much more effective application of attack aviation, because that's what helps generate tempo. So you get a good, like Desert Storm like assault, where you have mechanized and armored units online that are assaulting forward, and then you have they're being covered by aviation, something like in this case the A10, that's operating in front of them, identifying some targets, identifying some choke points or some enemy strong points, and kind of breaking up those formations to help the ground forces generate tempo. And when you get that rhythm when you get that rhythm right, which takes a lot of mutual trust, and it takes a lot of training to do that, which is really important, that I'll talk about here a little bit more. Then you really create a formidable unified military system that's going to roll over the enemy, which is why the ground war in 1991 took 4 days, because the ground forces working with the A10, working with some other aviation assets as well, were able to generate that kind of tempo. So that's how you create short, decisive wars. It's through that kind of detailed coordination. So by the end of Desert Storm, the A10s had flown more than 8,000 combat sorties. There were 4 A10s that were shot down, and there were 2 more that were hit and were written off, that never flew again after that. But there were a lot of other A10s that were hit by fire and were able to be patched up and put back in service throughout the course of that. So the A10 really did prove its value and prove its survivability. So now something that I always point out is that the real value of the A10 is the attack community that grew up around it. Now that was unintentional. The designers of the program didn't really think about this, but what happened when the A10 was created or was fielded was there was a community of pilots that grew up around it that were dedicated to the close air support mission. And this is what's really at stake. If the A10 is retired before a dedicated attack replacement is fielded, that community of pilots is going to go away. And we've seen this happen throughout history. So there were a lot of really effective close air support units. There's effective close air support capability that was created during World War II, but as soon as that war ended, the Air Force abandoned that. So by the time that Korea kicked off, less than 5 years after World War II, the Air Force had essentially no close air support capability. So it took 5 years, less than 5 years, for that capability to erode completely within the Air Force. And so, in Korea, they had to improvise a lot of close air support because it was necessary in Korea. But really, a lot of the close air support that was provided in Korea was done by the Navy and the Marine Corps. Vietnam was the same thing. The Air Force didn't have that capability, and so it had to be improvised on the fly. And a lot of soldiers died needlessly as a result. So, whenever whenever I talk about the A10, and I do advocate very heavily for, preserving the A10 fleet, I'm not trying to save the aircraft. What I'm really doing is I'm trying to save that attack community, because that's what's really at stake. If that community goes away, it's going to take a lot of effort down the road to reconstitute that. And it will probably happen after the need really manifests itself, and after a lot of young Americans died needlessly because they didn't have the support that they needed. So, I think that's about it for my formal part. I want to leave some time for some questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open this up.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dan. And to cut in here, I mean, you were talking about Desert Storm at the end, and kind of some of the criticisms that I've seen of the A10 stem from a different reading of that experience, which, as I understand it, is basically that they were put under a lot of restrictions on their use fairly early in the war. in terms of where they could operate, the circumstances under which they could operate because of attrition that they were suffering. And there's kind of similar worries that you'll see some people expressing around like the Russian war in Ukraine that they have a very similar aircraft, both sides of that conflict, the Frogfoot, that the reports have been mixed at best about air power in that conflict. And it seems like a lot of those pilots are flying like they perceive themselves to be in a very high threat environment where they're in great danger of being shot down. And so the argument that folks who are critical of the A-10 will make is we have lessons from history showing that this kind of vision of low, slow, persistent close air support is not something that's going to work on a modern battlefield. And so you would need something that's more like an F-35 in order to be able to provide air support at all. What do you make of that?
So there's a couple of problems with that. One, you can't really make a direct comparison between the Su-25 and the A-10. So the A-10 has all kinds of built-in systems that the Su-25 doesn't have. It has the best missile warning system of any aircraft, fourth or fifth generation. It has the ability to automatically deploy flare cocktails. Again, something that other aircraft don't have. So there's a lot of things that provide advantages. Electronic warfare jammers, ECM pods, like a whole bunch of things that the A-10 has. But the A-10, it also, like a lot of times when that argument is made that the A-10 can't survive in the battlefield, like in a modern battlefield, those are people that are talking about the A-10 in a vacuum, just operating by itself. And the A-10 doesn't do that. Really, no weapon system, does that generally. But the A-10 is not designed to be operated like an F-35 or even like an F-16 or an F-15 by flying like high and deep into enemy territory. Like the A-10 is designed to fight as part of an air-ground team. And so that goes back to combined arms warfare, where, and my experience in the Marine Corps, I was a tank officer in the Marine Corps, so I'm a combined arms guy, and so I was a planner, so I think I've planned operations where we integrated air and ground forces. There is not a single time in my entire Marine Corps career, 10 years, that I did this, when we planned a fires package that involved aviation, where we did not plan for to protect the planned measures to protect the aviation assets, whether that was routing them in a certain way to avoid enemy air defense threats, or actively shooting at in the Marine Corps we call it a SEAD mission, a suppression of enemy air defense mission, where we'd fire artillery at to suppress the missile launchers, the shooters. But then the other thing, when we talk about generating tempo, if you conduct operations properly and you get that, you generate that high operating tempo where you're moving really quick and ground and aviation forces are working together, the enemy air defenders aren't going to have that much of an opportunity to unlimber and take aim and employ their weapons to shoot the aircraft down. And so, because they're going to be too worried about getting a 120 millimeter tank round in their face, because they're going to be too busy running and fighting us to be able to unlimber and do that. Plus the Army has organic air defense assets as well, and the Army has a huge, much bigger artillery, fires capability than the Marine Corps has, and so and this is again something that they plan for as well. So when I hear those arguments, I always have to kind of shake my head, because they're talking about employing the A-10 in a way that it's not designed to operate. And quite frankly, a lot of other aircraft won't be able to operate in that kind of scenario either. So a bit fatuous. You should be very skeptical when you hear people talking about things like that.
Yes, we've got a couple of questions that kind of around the money and the politics of this. One from Jennifer is about whether some of these programs, I think particularly F-35, is kind of kept in need of financing or kept going in order to keep mechanics and other employees safe from layoffs. And then we've got a related question from Shreya, who says, does this rising preference for complex, expensive defense systems correlate with lobbying efforts from government contractors? And I would add to that question, do you think the consolidation that has happened in the defense industry has contributed to that?
Okay, well, we'll take these one at a time. So, yes, I think some of these programs, not specifically F-35 in this case, but there are definitely programs that are kept solely for the industrial base argument. The littoral combat ship is a great example of that. The Navy essentially abandoned that program a couple of years ago, but it continues specifically to keep the shipyards, the two shipyards, the one in Alabama and the one up in Wisconsin, active, ahead of the frigate program that's supposed to follow on to it. I always point out that if that's the best argument you have to keep a program going, or if that's the argument that they lead with about the economic impact of the program, that's a very big clue that the program has little military value, because we should be able to sell these programs solely on their military value. And if they're starting off with the economic argument, then you know that it's not a very effective weapon system. And then rising preference of highly complex, expensive defense systems. Yes, I think the defense industry has a lot of lobbyists, and they definitely try to dazzle lawmakers with the high tech gadget wizardry, and it's effective, and you can see it in programs. So again, I was a tank officer in the Marine Corps. I have a certain fondness for the Abrams tank just because I spent so much time on it, but I can tell you that it has some design drawbacks that affect operations. A really good example of that is the Abrams has a turbine engine. It's basically a helicopter engine on its side. That's what powers it. It's the only tank in the world that has something like that. Most tanks operate with diesel engines. And quite frankly, I would much rather the Abrams had a diesel engine. A well-designed diesel engine wants to run, and it's actually like happier when it does run. If anybody knows anything about cars, but a turbine engine doesn't. Like it hates to run, and it takes a lot of effort to keep it up and running. If any of you have ever spent any time on an Air Force base on the flight line, you see signs warning about FOD, about like picking up trash, and they'll do FOD walks where they're walking, they're just picking up any, bolts or, rocks or something like that happens to be on the ground, because, the worst thing that can happen is something like that getting picked up and sucked into an aircraft turbine engine, because it'll just wreak havoc on that. Well, where does a tank operate? It operates in nothing but FOD. And so we have to take enormous precautions, multiple filters to keep that thing up and running. And so you actually have to stop, like in combat, to blow your filters. That complexity, it's useful for the lobbyists to sell these programs at the beginning, and they can also use that, to help sell these programs. To generate that political support. And I'll give you a really good quick example of that. If you go back to late 2015, and you can find I wrote about this at the time, but you can find the press conference that Deborah Lee James, who was the then Secretary of the Air Force, and General Mark Welsh, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, where they announced Northrop Grumman as the contractor to build the B-21, the new bomber. And they said that, it's really secret program. We can't tell you a lot of details about it. Like, we still don't know the value of the development contract. They still haven't told us the dollar amount years and years later. But what they did tell us was where components of it were going to be built. And so I had all kinds of fun just running a Google search, just you're saying that everything's about this secret, but you're willing to tell us where where components are going to be built. So I looked up like what the contractors built there, and I wrote a piece about it. Like, oh, well, they say it's really secret, but just a quick Google search will tell you that that's how I know that there's a company in Washington that builds transparencies. I was from doing that piece all those years ago. So yeah, lobbying plays a big part in this, and it does. It affects designs, and then it ultimately, at its worst, will affect operations down the road. So yeah, it can be a really insidious force.
And defense consolidation, do you think that's a factor here in the contractor sector?
I think it is, because we end up with the same, you kind of have the same basic designs. You look at, 40 years ago, you had, who were the contractors? Was it McDonnell Douglas that built the F-15? And then it was General Dynamics that built the F-16. And if you look at the designs of those aircraft, they're very different, right? But you look, we're dealing with the F-22 right now and the F-35. They're both built by Lockheed Martin. You look at the aircraft, and sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference, between the two. But because they were largely the same design teams, they both have a lot of the same, issues. And so, yeah, defense consolidation, it was really a big product. Kind of from the same time frame as when the A10, the F-35 program began in the early 90s. That had that created a lot of problems. Competition's a good thing, and it spurs innovation. And so, and it's not something that's gonna be fixed anytime soon, unfortunately.
So we've got a question from Graham about whether the A-10 has been tested against modern enemy fighters. Wouldn't it be very vulnerable? And in particular against a peer adversary where we might not have the kind of overwhelming air superiority that we're used to.
Right. So I'll tell you what, if we're operating the A-10 and the A-10 has to swat down enemy fighters, then the Air Force as a whole failed. The Air Force has fighter planes that should be dealing with that threat to protect the other assets. That being said, the A-10 is a lot more capable than a lot of people give it credit. There have been some tests recently. There was a congressionally mandated test in 2018, to test it was a close air support fly-off test between the F-35 and the A-10. And I wrote a lot about it at the time, actually, as the test was going on, because I had a copy of the test schedule leaked to me. And so I realized that it wasn't a great close air support test. But what the test did do, the test was designed to make the A-10 look bad, make the F-35 look good. And the way that they thought they were going to make the F-30 or the A-10 look bad was they created these really wicked air defense scenarios that they just expected the A-10s to get swatted out of the sky. And so that was 4 years ago that those tests happened, and you still haven't seen the report from it. And there's a reason for that, because I've spoken to many people directly involved in those tests, and I can tell you that not a single A-10 was shot down in that test, and that test was designed to shoot down a lot of A-10s. Now, a lot of that had to do with just the tactical ability of the pilots, but the design of the aircraft itself. Again, the aircraft was designed to be survivable in these kind of environments, and it works, and it worked then. So we've been calling for years to have that test report released, and yeah, that's under lock and key, and it's very unlikely that as long as the Air Force is still trying to retire the A-10, that report's going to come out. So yeah. It's a lot more survivable than you think it is.
Yeah, and so one of the questions that I'm thinking of here, you talked about the importance of the attack community, and like, let's say the A-10 does ultimately get canceled or becomes inoperable because you've written that the Air Force has done some stuff that's going to reduce the availability of the aircraft from a maintenance standpoint. Suppose that the A-10 no longer is viable as a combat tool purely for Air Force reasons, not for combat reasons. Do you think, what would you do in that case to preserve the attack community? Would you say, okay, let's have, basically an FA-35 community or something, in the sense of like a dedicated attack community within the F-35 community, or maybe leverage some of the stuff that people were talking about for Afghanistan with like the Super Tucano and some of these really light aircraft? Like, what do you do with the attack community if you don't have the A-10 and you want to preserve it?
Well, I guess if I was in charge of things, the scenario that you just described about designating certain squadrons, F-35 squadrons specifically to perform the A-10 or to perform the close air support mission, that would be the best thing that could happen. But I do not see a scenario where big Air Force would allow something like that to happen. I do know that a lot of the A-10s that are still in service today are reserve units, National Guard units, and a lot of those pilots that fly the A-10, they don't want to fly anything else. And so a lot of them would very likely just drop papers and retire rather than have to transition to another aircraft. I've met a couple of F-35 pilots over the years, and my favorite F-35 pilot meeting happened at an A-10 squadron. He was a guy who had recently left the active duty Air Force after 12 years. He started flying the F-16, transitioned to the F-35, decided that it sucked, and then he got out of the active Air Force and he started flying the A-10s in the National Guard. And there's a lot of loyalty to that. It's not, and again, it's not to the aircraft. It's actually to the mission. I remember one of my favorite conversations with an A-10 pilot, a couple of years ago. This guy told me, he's like, I don't really like to fly. And that's not why I do what I do. I like dropping bombs. Like, I like firing ordnance. And the flying the plane is incidental. And he had some I think he was like if I remember correctly, he was a banking executive in his in his civilian life. He didn't fly at all in his civilian life. He just he liked being an A-10 pilot because you got to fire a big gun and drop bombs.
Yeah. So another question would just be for future programs, what are the lessons that you would suggest people take from the experience of the F-35, which, I think a lot of people would agree with your basic premise that like, this is a good example of how not to buy an airplane.
So there's a couple things. One, avoid a joint program at all cost. So if the Air Force needs they decide they need a new plane, you let that just be an Air Force, an Air Force program. And that's a lesson I think is going to be applied. You're starting to see that discussion about that with the end or the next generation air dominance. So the Air Force is, developing its version, the Navy's developing their version. So I think that problem, that issue has been, that lesson's been learned, and I think it's being applied. Now, a lot of the other lessons, one, you have to have a competitive prototype process at the beginning. That's something that did not really happen with the F-35. There was a demonstration, like a flight demonstration. It's actually kind of funny. I should have found a picture of it. Look up the X-32. Do a Google image search of that. That was the competing design in the Joint Strike Fighter program before Lockheed won it. It's the goofiest looking aircraft you've ever seen. So it's not hard to see why the Lockheed design won out. But what that was not a true competitive prototype. Because they were just flight demonstrations, and like nothing was fully developed in it. It was just to show kind of proof of concept that you can design this aircraft, to take off and land vertically. Basically, that was kind of the big part of that. So all the development happened after, after Lockheed won the contract. So that's one of the reasons why it's been so long. Like if you go back and you look at programs like the AX program, there was the two prototypes that were flown was the AX9 and the AX10. And we got the A10 out of that. Both of those aircraft were like, those prototypes could have gone into combat. Like they were fully functional combat aircraft. Same thing with the lightweight fighter program that produced the F-16. The YF-17 that later became the F-18, and then the YF-16. Both of those aircraft were fully functional combat aircraft at the time that they were doing the competitive fly-off. And so there was really not a ton of work that needed to be done after that. So getting back to true competitive prototyping will head off a lot of these problems. But then even just more than that, like, do not try to do too much. Simplicity is such an important aspect in all things, in all military matters. So it's important to remember that weapons. I don't care what we're talking about. We're talking about a pistol or the B-21. Weapons are nothing but tools. War is a human endeavor. Wars are fought by people, using good ideas, and the weapons that they employ are just tools. And for whatever job you have, you want the simplest tool possible in order to perform its intended task. And so the requirements people in all the services, as they're looking at these programs, they need to be ruthless going through these designs, and they need to really critically evaluate every single component that the contractor is trying to to add to these systems. And if it's possible to get away without it, then get away without it. It needs to be tossed aside. You want to strip these things down to their barest essentials, because that's going to greatly increase. It's going to control costs. So you're going to be able to get the force structure that you need, and it's going to reduce your training time. So you don't need to have a PhD in astrophysics to operate one of these things. Quite frankly, I think it's ridiculous that you have to be a commissioned officer to fly an aircraft. It hasn't always been the case. It's kind of a vanity thing within the pilot community. But if you design simpler aircraft, I mean, the Army has warrant officers that fly, and it should be the same thing, in the Air Force as well. That's simplicity is a huge thing, and then being very careful to design the contractor out of the weapon system. That's another big problem with the F-35. The F-35 is designed from the very beginning. It was designed to have the contractor, Lockheed Martin, perform the majority of the maintenance tasks to sustain the fleet long term, and that's kind of the business model for the F-35 program. It's one of the reasons why that you have that $1.7 trillion figure to sustain it, because the services they can't operate the program without Lockheed Martin. And so that incentivized Lockheed Martin to make the aircraft more complex just to justify those long-term sustainment contracts. So if I was a member of Congress and I was evaluating somebody was, if I'm sitting on the Senate Armed Services Committee and I'm being asked to approve funding for the NGAD, one of the first questions that I would ask of whoever's telling me this is, how many contractors, field service representatives from the contractor am I going to need to operate this on each base? And if the answer is more than one, I'm going to say, nope, I am not giving you any money for this program until you design yourself out of this. So you design this to the point that it's simple enough that uniformed service members can maintain this thing in the field. Then I know that you do not have a fully developed system. So yeah, there are a whole bunch of other things, but those are the big lessons that I would love to see applied in the future.
Yeah. So just to close out here, the question that we always ask all of our guests at the very end, what's one piece of advice you'd give to someone who wants to follow in your footsteps professionally?
Oh, wow. There's a long road that I took to get here. If you could go back to September 10th, 2001 and find the 23-year-old version of me and ask me where I'd be on August 17th, 2022, the 23-year-old version of me would confidently tell you that he would have, just wrapped up, his show as the anchor of ABC World News Tonight. So that was my ambition as a young man, to be a television celebrity. But then the war intervened, and I kind of accidentally engineered myself for my current role, because I had my television background before I joined the Marine Corps. And then when I was in the Marine Corps, I learned, the origins of Marine Corps doctrine stems back to actually an Air Force fighter pilot named John Boyd. And so I learned about him, and I learned about his work in defense reform. And so that I accidentally engineered myself to be a professional military reformer, I guess. That's a difficult, difficult path to replicate, probably. But, to prepare yourself for something like this, just be curious. And you want to, read as much as you can. I'm a military historian, and so I study a lot of military history, and so read widely as you can. Try to find the bigger lessons. Don't just try to study history to remember dates and names and be able to recount tales, historical tales, but try to learn those big lessons that aren't always obvious as you're reading history, and then just be curious enough to ask difficult questions, question people in power, and just because somebody has 4 stars in their on their shoulder, doesn't mean that they're infallible. Just because somebody is has a big title like Secretary of Defense or something like that, doesn't mean that you shouldn't question their decisions. And just be curious enough to dive a little deeper than what's being fed you in press releases, and I guess have the develop the courage to be able to to stand up and question authority.
Well, with that, thank you very much, Dan Grazier, for speaking with us. Thank you to all of you for attending. This has been another digital discussion with the John Quincy Adams Society. Good night to everybody.